The street outside Nirmal Hrdai smelled of diesel exhaust and marigolds sold for temple offerings, and underneath both, if the wind was still, the smell of the market's rotting vegetable heaps 2 lanes over. It was the smell Calcutta wore most days in the 1950s, when the city still bore the scars of partition and the pavements filled each night with people who had nowhere else to be. A small woman, in a white sari edged with 3 blue stripes, walked that street the way she walked every street in that quarter of the city, slowly, eyes down, looking for what everyone else had trained themselves not to see. She found him against a wall near the fish market, half in the gutter where the monsoon runoff had carried him. He was an old man, though it was hard to tell his age. Hunger and disease had worn the years off him strangely, aging his skin while wasting his frame down to something like a child's. Ants had found the wounds on his back. He had been there some time, long enough that the people stepping around him on their way to the market had stopped seeing him as a man and started seeing him as an obstacle, a thing to be walked past the way one walks past a fallen cart or a pile of refuse. Calcutta had many such men in those years. The city could not look at all of them and go on living its life, and so it had learned, as cities do, to look through them instead. Mother Teresa did not walk past him. She knelt down in the gutter. She was already 50 years old by then, her knees no younger than anyone else's, and the ground beneath her was filthy with the runoff of the whole street. She did not send for a stretcher first, did not call out for help before she had done anything herself. She bent close to his ruined face, the kind of face that makes most people turn away, the kind that had been left too long without water, without care, without a single hand laid on it in tenderness, and she looked at it the way a mother looks at the face of her own child. This is the first thing to understand about her, before anything else is said. She was not being brave. She was not performing an act of charity for anyone's benefit, least of all her own. She looked at that face, and she saw, with the same plain certainty with which she saw the sun in the sky, the face of Jesus Christ. She called it, all her life, the distressing disguise, Christ hidden in the ruined body of the poor, hidden so completely that the world walks past him 1,000 times a day and never once suspects. It was not poetry to her. It was not a comforting way of speaking about compassion so that hard work might feel more bearable. She meant it with the same flat, factual seriousness with which a person means that bread is bread and water is water. Christ had said it himself, in words she had read and reread until they had worn a channel straight through the center of her soul. Whatsoever you do to the least of these, you do unto me. She took the Lord at his word in a way that very few people, even very holy people, have ever quite managed to do. When she knelt beside a dying man in a Calcutta gutter, she believed, not hoped, not imagined, but believed that she was kneeling beside her Lord. Cleaning his wounds, she did not flinch. That, too, is something to sit with for a moment before moving on, because the flinch is where most of us live. We give from a certain distance, we write the check, we say the prayer, we feel the pang of pity and let it pass through us like weather. She had crossed some threshold long before that morning where distance was no longer possible for her, where the suffering of a stranger had become as immediate and as claiming as the suffering of her own family. She lifted him. She was not a large woman, and by then the years of fasting and overwork had left her thinner than her own sisters liked to see, and she carried what she could not lift alone with help that came, as it nearly always came for her, at the exact moment she needed it, and not one moment before. He was brought to Nirmal Hrdai, the home for the dying she had opened in a disused temple building at Kaligat, where the goddess Kali was worshipped a few dozen yards away, and the poor of Calcutta had nowhere clean to die. Pure heart, the name meant. She wanted the poorest of the poor to die there, knowing, for the first time in their lives, that they were loved. It is worth pausing on what happened next, because it is the part the world remembers least and needed most. She did not simply deposit him with the sisters and move on to the next task on a list. She washed him herself. She held water to his lips. She sat with him. Whether he lived an hour or a week, whatever medicine could do for him was done. But what she gave him was not primarily medical. It was the plain, unhurried attention of someone who believed he mattered infinitely, who was in no rush to be anywhere else, who looked into that ravaged face without the smallest flicker of disgust or condescension, because she did not see a case, or a project, or even, in the end, a poor man. She saw her Lord, disguised, and she loved him there exactly as she would have loved him robed in glory. This is the woman this book has come to introduce, not the statue. Not the holy card with the soft golden light and the saccharine smile, the image so many people carry in their minds when they hear her name, a kind of plaster saint, hands folded, eyes lifted piously to heaven, safely distant from anything so undignified as a gutter or a wound crawling with ants. That image, however well meant, has done her a disservice because it has made her comfortable. It has turned a woman who spent her life on her knees in the dirt of the world's worst slums into a decoration, something to admire from a clean and reasonable distance, the way one admires a painting behind glass. The real woman was smaller than people expect, under 5 feet, with a face that grew more lined and more radiant in the same years, as though the two were somehow the same process. Her hands were rough, cracked in places, the hands of someone who had scrubbed floors and dressed wounds and hauled water for decades. Her sandals were often the cheapest kind sold in the Calcutta bazaars, the same sandals worn by the poor she served, because she had made a vow of poverty, and she intended to live inside it rather than merely profess it. Her sari, the now famous white cotton with the blue border, chosen because it cost less than a rupee and was the sort of thing a poor Bengali woman might wear, had been mended more than once. She was not glamorous. She was not, by the ordinary measures the world uses, impressive to look at. And that, too, is essential to understanding her, because she would have been the first to insist on it. She did not want to be looked at. She wanted the person in front of her to be looked at, seen, touched, loved, and she had discovered, somewhere in the years before this book's story properly begins, that the surest way to make that happen was to disappear a little herself, to become, in her own words that would become famous only because so many people found in them something they had been hungry for without knowing it, a pencil in the hand of God, writing a love letter to the world. A pencil does not admire itself. It does not pause partway through a sentence to consider its own gracefulness. It simply lets itself be used, stroke after stroke, until the page says what the hand holding it wanted said. That was the ambition of her whole life, stated as plainly as she ever stated anything, to get out of the way enough that Christ's love could move through her unobstructed, the way light moves through a clean window. She did not always feel worthy of that use. There would come decades, and the fuller story of this book will not hide them, when she felt God's hand had gone silent around the pencil entirely, when the darkness inside her matched the darkness of the street she walked. But on that morning by the fish market, kneeling in the gutter over a dying stranger, none of that interior struggle was visible. What was visible was only this: a woman who saw a face nobody else would look at, and loved it without hesitation, because she believed with her whole being that the face belonged to God. It is tempting, meeting her for the first time in a scene like this one, to treat the moment as extraordinary, a single act of heroic charity, remarkable precisely because it stands out from an ordinary life the way a mountain peak stands out from a plain. But that would misunderstand her completely. This was not the peak. This was the plain. She did this, in one form or another, every single day for nearly 50 years. Thousands of dying men and women were carried into Nirmal Hriday over the decades of her life, and she did not reserve her attention for the ones whose stories might later be told, the ones whose faces might make for a moving photograph. She knelt in the gutter for the man nobody would ever hear of, with exactly the same tenderness she would have given a king. That consistency, that terrible, beautiful sameness of love, applied without discrimination to every last soul who crossed her path, is the true measure of who she was. Sanctity is rarely a single dazzling act. It is usually 1,000 small ones, repeated with a fidelity that never announces itself, until one day the world looks up and realizes it has been living, unnoticed, alongside a saint. She was born Agnes Gonxha Bojakshu, in a city that no longer exists under that name in the country she knew it by, to a mother whose own quiet charity toward the poor of Skopje would shape everything her daughter later became. She would become a Loreto sister, a schoolteacher behind convent walls, before an inspiration on a train to Darjeeling in September of 1946 tore her life open and set her walking into the slums with nothing but a handful of rupees and a trust that God would provide the rest. She would found a congregation that started with a handful of sisters and grew, by the time of her death, into a family of thousands, serving the poorest of the poor on every continent on earth. All of that is still ahead in this book, and it deserves to be told slowly, the way any life worth loving deserves to be told, not rushed past on the way to the famous ending, but dwelt in, chapter by chapter, the way she dwelt with the dying. But it begins here, in this gutter, because this is where the truth of her is plainest. Before the Nobel Prize, before the interviews with journalists who could not quite believe what they were seeing, before her face became one of the most recognized in the 20th century, there was simply a woman who knelt down where no one else would kneel, and looked at a ruined face, and saw her God. That is the invitation this whole book extends, not to admire her from across the room, the way one admires a saint on a card, to kneel down beside her, close enough to smell the street and feel the rough cotton of her sari and see what she saw, because she would tell you, if she could, that the man in the gutter was never really the point of the story. The point was always what she recognized bending over him, and the question, quiet and enormous, of whether we might learn, even a little, to recognize it too. The house on the street in Skopje had a courtyard, and in the courtyard there was often a stranger sitting at the family table. This was not unusual. It was, in fact, the rule of the house. Drana Bojakshiu, a devout and exacting woman, kept an open door for the destitute of the city, and she did not distinguish between the guests she loved and the guests she had never met. A beggar at the door was fed before the family sat down. A widow with nothing was given a place at the table as though she were an aunt come for Sunday dinner. Nicola Bojakshiu, prosperous and generous in his own right, never once complained about the arrangement, and the children, 3 of them, Lazar, Aga, and the youngest, a small dark-eyed girl named Anjek, called Gonxha by everyone who loved her, grew up believing this was simply what a family did. You fed the hungry, you made room, you did not ask a poor man his name before you gave him bread. Gonxha, the word means flower bud in Albanian, and it suited her, small and quiet, and already unfolding toward something no one could yet see, was born on August 26, 1910, in the city of Skopje, then a provincial town of the Ottoman Empire, soon to belong to Serbia, later to Yugoslavia, and later still to the Republic of North Macedonia. The family was Albanian, Catholic in a region thick with Orthodox Serbs and Muslim Turks and Albanians of every religious stripe, a minority within a minority, faith and blood both marking them as distinct. She was baptized the day after her birth, and all her life she kept that second date, August 27th, as her true birthday, the day her soul, and not merely her body, came into the world. It was a small preference, but it told you something about how she would come to see every threshold in life. What mattered was not simply the arriving, but the arriving into grace. Nicola Bojakshiu was a builder and a merchant, a man with a hand in construction and in trade, prosperous enough to keep a comfortable house and send his children to good schools, and restless enough to involve himself in the perilous politics of Albanian nationalism at a time when to speak for Albanian independence was to invite the attention of men who did not welcome dissent. He was, by every account that has come down through the family and the biographers who later traced her life to its roots, a warm father, fond of music, fond of his children, a man who brought his family on pilgrimage to the shrine of the Black Madonna at Letnice in the mountains above the city, a devotion the family kept for generations. He was also, by the same accounts, a man of strong opinion in rooms where strong opinion was dangerous. In 1919, when Gonxha was 8 years old, Nicola came home from a political dinner gravely ill. He was rushed to the hospital. Within hours, he was dead. The family always believed, and the political climate of the time gives the belief every plausibility, that he had been poisoned, silenced by men whose politics he had opposed. No trial ever settled the matter. What is certain is that a prosperous household became, almost overnight, a household in want, and a little girl who had never known hunger watched her mother take up the full weight of raising 3 children with no husband and, for a time, no income at all. It would have been reasonable for Drana Bojakshiu to close the door then. Grief alone would have excused it, and poverty would have made excuse unnecessary. No one would have blamed a widow with 3 children for keeping what little she had for her own table. She did not close it. If anything, the door opened wider. Drana went to work, first taking in embroidery and cloth work, later opening a small shop of her own, selling fabric and rugs, building back with her own hands something like the security the family had lost. And through all of it, through the years of counting coins, through the labor of raising Lazar into manhood and Aga and Gonxha into womanhood alone, she never stopped setting a place at the table for whoever needed one. There is a saying that has come down from that household, spoken by Drana to her children so often it became a kind of family law. Never eat a single mouthful unless you are sharing it with others. It was not a metaphor to her, It was a rule for the kitchen. And Gonxha, small and watchful, absorbed it the way children absorb the deepest things, not by being told, but by being shown, meal after meal, guest after guest, for years. It is worth pausing here, because this is the soil the whole of the later life grew from, and it would be a mistake to treat it as background. The woman who would one day kneel in the gutters of Calcutta and lift dying strangers into her arms did not learn that gesture in a convent, though the convent would refine it and consecrate it. She learned it first at a table in Skopje, watching her widowed mother feed people who had no claim on her whatsoever, simply because they were hungry and she had bread. Every biographer who has tried to locate the origin of Mother Teresa's charity has eventually arrived back at this kitchen, and rightly so. Grace builds on nature, the old theologians say, and the nature God had chosen to build on, in this case, was a small Albanian household that fed strangers as a matter of course and never once made a display of it. The other great formation of those years was the parish. The Bojakshu family belonged to the parish of the Sacred Heart in Skopje, staffed by Jesuit priests who ran the church with a rare combination of rigor and warmth, and it was there, rather than only at home, that Gonxha's faith took on its particular shape and direction. The parish was alive in a way that parishes sometimes are and sometimes are not, full of confraternities and devotions, choirs and processions, a community that did not treat Sunday Mass as the whole of religion but as its center, radiating outward into the rest of the week. Gonxha sang in the choir. She was known for a sweet, clear voice and for a seriousness about prayer that set her apart even among devout children in a devout parish. She joined the sodality of Our Lady, called locally the Congregation of Mary, a lay confraternity for young people built around devotion to the Blessed Virgin and a life of active charity. And it was through the sodality, more than through any single sermon or catechism lesson, that the wider world first came pressing in on her imagination. The Jesuits at Sacred Heart did something that would prove, in retrospect, providential almost beyond calculation. They kept their parish informed, in vivid and continuous detail, about the missions. Letters arrived from Jesuit missionaries serving in Bengal, in India, describing the poverty of the villages, the multitudes without a priest, without the sacraments, without so much as the rudiments of the gospel ever having reached them. These letters were read aloud, discussed, prayed over. The parish held missionary societies and collected funds, kept maps of where its priests were serving, tracked the progress of the church's work in lands that must have seemed, to a girl on a small street in Skopje, as distant and as strange as the moon. Gonxha listened to all of it. She read the letters that were shared. She prayed for missionaries whose names she would never otherwise have known, and something in her, quiet, unremarked, entirely unlike the sort of thing a child announces at dinner, began to take root. It is here that the biographers and the missionaries of charity themselves, in the memories they have preserved of their foundress's own recollections, place a moment that deserves to be named plainly rather than hurried past. At around the age of 12, Gonxha felt, for the first time, a distinct and unmistakable conviction that God was asking something of her, that her life was not simply hers to spend as she pleased, but was being called toward a particular purpose, and that the purpose had something to do with the missions she had heard about in the letters read aloud at Sacred Heart. She did not receive a vision. She did not hear an audible voice. What she received, by her own later account, was a certainty, quiet, persistent, entirely without drama, that she was meant for religious life, and that the shape of that life would somehow carry her far from Skopje toward the poor of a country she had never seen. A certainty at 12 is not the same as a decision at 12, and Gonxha, wisely, did not treat it as one. She told almost no one. She continued at school, continued in the sodality, continued singing in the choir and helping her mother in the shop, and she let the conviction sit inside her for 6 more years, tested by time and by the ordinary business of growing up, before she ever spoke of it to a priest or made any move toward acting on it. This restraint tells you something important about her that would remain true for the rest of her life. She was not a woman given to impulsive gestures dressed up as inspiration. When God moved in her, she waited to be certain it was God, and then she obeyed without further hesitation, but the waiting came first, every time, even at 12 years old, even before anyone was watching to see whether she would. Those 6 years were not empty ones. She grew close to her parish priest, Father Franjo Jambrenkovic, who became something of a spiritual father to her, and who, by the accounts that survive, took her spiritual life seriously in a way that mattered enormously to a serious child. She continued to hear, year after year, of the missionary work of the Society of Jesus in Bengal, and in particular of a group of priests from the Yugoslav province who had gone to serve in a region of India where the local Catholic population, though small, was growing, and where the need for workers in the vineyard was, by every letter that reached Skopje, immense. It was through these same Jesuit connections that word eventually came of the Sisters of Loreto, the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, an order of religious women with a house and a mission in Bengal, running schools for the daughters of both wealthy and poor families, and in need, as every mission always is, of more hands. Gonxha's sister Aga had, some years earlier, encouraged her toward serious thought about a vocation, sensing perhaps before anyone else did the direction her sister's soul was leaning. Her mother Drana, when the moment finally came for the certainty of childhood to become the decision of a young woman, did not stand in the way, though it cost her more than the record fully tells. To send a daughter to religious life was one thing. Every devout Albanian mother might hope for such an honor in the family. To send her, as it became clear this call intended, not merely into a convent, but across the world, to a country whose name most of Skopje could not have located on a map, was another thing entirely. And there is no reason to think it was easy for Drana to say yes to it, but she did. What strikes anyone who traces this chapter of the story is how ordinary the outward details are, and how extraordinary the interior thread running through them turns out, in hindsight, to be. A girl loses her father young, her mother, widowed and poor, feeds beggars anyway. A parish reads missionary letters aloud on Sunday. A child listens. Nothing about any of this, taken piece by piece, looks like the beginning of one of the great Christian lives of the 20th century. And yet by the time Gonxha Bojakshiu was 18 years old, every piece of it had done its silent work. The charity learned at her mother's table had become a settled habit of soul. The faith formed at Sacred Heart had become a serious, examined conviction rather than an inherited custom. And the quiet certainty that first visited her at 12, that God wanted her life for something particular, something that would take her far from home, had survived 6 years of ordinary adolescence unshaken, tested by patience rather than dissolved by it. She would leave Skopje in the autumn of 1928 to enter the Sisters of Loreto, and she would never see her mother or her sister Aga again in this life, a fact so stark it is tempting to look away from it, though the record does not allow that. But that departure, and the years of Loreto formation that came before Calcutta ever entered her story, belong to what follows. What matters, before we go any further, is this. The girl who left Skopje was not an empty vessel about to be filled by India, by Calcutta, by the poor of the Motagil slums. She arrived at all of that already formed, by a father's sudden death, by a mother's unshakable hospitality, by a parish that never let a child forget the wider world's hunger, and by a certainty that had taken root in her at 12 years old and had simply, patiently, waited for its hour. The pencil, as she would later call herself in God's hand, had already been shaped and sharpened long before it was ever put to paper. Skopje did that work. What remained was for her to be sent. On the morning of September 26, 1928, a young woman stood on the platform of the Skopje train station and said goodbye to her mother for the last time on this earth, though neither of them knew it yet. Drana Bojakshiu did not weep, not there, not where anyone could see. She had raised her daughter to give herself entirely to whatever God asked, and now God was asking for everything, and a mother who had spent her whole life teaching that lesson could hardly refuse to live it herself. Agnes was 18 years old. She carried a small suitcase and a heart already given away. She would never see her mother's face again. She would never see her sister Aga's face again, not once, not in 40 years, though letters would cross the distance between them for as long as politics allowed, and then stop entirely when communism sealed Albania and Yugoslavia into silence. This is a hard truth, and the book will not soften it. Mother Teresa left home at 18 and never returned, never held her mother's hand again, never sat at her mother's table. The Bojakshiu family that had gathered every evening for prayer around Nicola's chair and then around the space where his chair had been, now scattered further still. Agnes went toward India. Drana and Aga stayed in Skopje and later fled to Tirana and waited and wrote and hoped for the rest of their lives for a reunion the world's cruelty never allowed. But on that September morning there was no way to know how long the separation would run, or how final it would prove. There was only the train, and the platform, and a mother's blessing given without a single tear that Agnes could see. The road to Calcutta did not run in a straight line. It ran first to Zagreb, in Croatia, where Agnes met two other young women bound for the same distant purpose, Gonxha and another postulant, girls she had likely never met before that week and would now travel alongside across half the world. From Zagreb, the little group continued to Paris, where a representative of the Loreto sisters conducted the interview that would decide whether Agnes Gonxha was truly suited to the religious life she believed God was calling her toward. It was not a formality. The sisters of Loreto needed young women who could endure, physically, temperamentally, spiritually, a life spent in ocean and a continent away from everything and everyone they had ever known. Agnes passed. Of course she did. She had been preparing for this moment, whether she knew it by that name or not, since the day she pressed her forehead to the floor of the Sacred Heart Church in Skopje and felt the pull toward something larger than the town could hold. From Paris the road turned toward Ireland, and here it grew strange, in a way none of Agnes's Skopje years could have prepared her for. The Sisters of Loreto, the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary, to give them their full and proper name, were an Irish congregation, founded 2 centuries earlier by Mary Teresa Ball, dedicated to the education of girls, and long since spread across the far edges of the British Empire, including its missions in India. To join them, to be sent by them to Bengal, Agnes first had to become, however briefly, an Irish woman among Irish women. She arrived at Loreto Abbey in Rathfarnham on the outskirts of Dublin in the last weeks of 1928, a Balkan girl who spoke Albanian and Serbo-Croatian and some French, and who now had 6 weeks only, to learn enough English to survive a missionary life in an English-run colony halfway around the world. 6 weeks is not long to learn a language. It is barely long enough to learn the shape of a new alphabet's sounds in your mouth. But Agnes Bojakshiu had already shown, in Skopje, in the sodality, in the letters she read from Jesuit missionaries in India, a mind that fixed itself on a goal and did not release it. She learned. She learned enough English in that Irish autumn to cross an ocean and begin, however haltingly, a religious life conducted in a language that had been entirely foreign to her only months before. It is worth pausing on this alone, not as a footnote of trivia, but as a window into the woman she already was at 18. She would spend the rest of her life speaking, writing, begging, and preaching in English, a language not her own, a language she had to build inside herself from nothing in the space of 6 autumn weeks, in a country she would visit only that once. Every word of the missionaries of charity's rule, every letter she would write to bishops and popes and presidents, every plea she would make before the United Nations and the Nobel Committee, would come to the world in this borrowed tongue, mastered under pressure, in a hurry, because the ship to India was waiting and could not wait for fluency. The ship left in December 1928. Agnes Bojakshiu, not yet a novice in any formal sense, but already committed body and soul to the life she was sailing toward, crossed from Europe into the vast unfamiliar water that separated the world she knew from the world she had chosen. She arrived in Calcutta on January 6, 1929, the feast of the Epiphany, the day the Church remembers the Magi following a star to a place they had never been, guided by nothing but faith that the star meant something and was worth the whole hard journey. No one recorded whether Agnes noticed the significance of the date on which she first set foot on Indian soil. It is difficult to imagine that a girl so soaked in the feasts and fasts of the church calendar did not feel the weight of it, even briefly, even in the noise and heat and strangeness of a Calcutta harbor unlike anything Skopje had ever shown her. Wise men, following a star, arriving at last at the place where God had chosen to be found in poverty and littleness. It was a fitting day, whether she marked it or not, for the beginning of everything that would follow. But Calcutta was not yet her home, not in those first days. The Loreto novitiate for young women preparing to enter religious life in India was not in the city itself, but in Darjeeling, high in the hill country near the border with Nepal and Sikkim, where the air ran cool and thin, and the Himalayan peaks stood visible on clear mornings, a place as far from the crowded lowland heat of Bengal's capital as it was possible to find within the same province. It was to Darjeeling that Agnes traveled next, to begin in earnest the formation that would shape her from a devout girl into a professed religious sister. The novitiate is not a season the world sees. It happens behind walls, in silence, in the slow and often unglamorous work of learning to pray as a community prays, to obey as a community obeys, to let go, piece by piece, of the self one arrived with. Agnes spent these years in Darjeeling doing exactly this, studying, praying the hours of the Loreto rule, learning to teach, absorbing the particular charism of an Irish teaching congregation transplanted into Bengali soil. She was not idle in these years, and she was not sheltered from the poverty around her either. Even as a novice, still years from the vocation within a vocation that would one day carry her out of Loreto's walls entirely, Agnes could not have missed what lay just beyond the mission compound's gates. Darjeeling had its own poor. Bengal's roads in the late 1920s and early 1930s were never empty of the destitute, the diseased, the abandoned. The girl who would one day found a congregation devoted entirely to the poorest of the poor was, in these quiet novitiate years, already living daily in a country where poverty was not a concept read about in mission letters, but a fact walked past on the way to chapel. It was during this period of formation, in accordance with the ancient custom of religious life, that Agnes took a new name, the name by which the entire world would come to know her, though she could not have guessed, kneeling in that novitiate chapel, how far the name would travel. She wished, it is remembered, to take the name of Teresa of Avila, the great Spanish mystic and reformer whose writings on prayer had shaped centuries of Catholic spiritual life. But another novice in the same house had already claimed that name before her. Agnes turned instead to a second Teresa, Thérèse of Lisieux, the young French Carmelite known to the Church as the Little Flower, who had died at 24, having never left her convent, having done nothing the world would call remarkable, and who had nonetheless become one of the most beloved saints of the modern age, precisely because of the smallness of her means and the vastness of her love. Thérèse had taught what she called her little way, the conviction that sanctity is built not from grand gestures but from small acts of love, offered faithfully, in hidden places, without recognition or reward. Agnes chose the Spanish spelling of the name, Teresa, in place of the French Thérèse, so as to distinguish her devotion from a straightforward imitation, but the spiritual debt was unmistakable and would remain unmistakable for the rest of her life. Sister Teresa, formerly Agnes Gonxha Bojakshiu of Skopje, made her first vows as a sister of Loreto in Darjeeling in May of 1931. It is worth sitting with the choice for a moment because it says something true about who she already was and who she would become. The world would one day know Mother Teresa as a woman of tremendous, almost impossible public consequence, a Nobel laureate, a household name on every continent, a figure whose face appeared on the covers of magazines that had never before put a nun on their cover. And yet the name she chose for herself, at the very outset, at 20 years old, kneeling in a hill country chapel, far from any camera or headline, was the name of a saint, famous for littleness, not grandeur, littleness. The Little Flower's little way would run underneath everything Mother Teresa did for the rest of her life, however large that life eventually grew in the world's eyes. The conviction that love shone in small, faithful, hidden acts, a bandage changed, a dying man's hand held, a beggar's face washed, carries within it the whole weight of the gospel, no smaller and no less than any grand and public deed. She would say, decades later, that she and her sisters were not called to do great things, only small things with great love. The seed of that teaching was planted the day she chose her name. After first vows came the return to Calcutta itself, not the harbor city glimpsed in passing on the way up to Darjeeling, but the city that would become, in every sense that matters, her home for the rest of her earthly life. Sister Teresa was assigned to Loreto Entally, the Loreto convent and school complex in the Entally district of Calcutta, home to St. Mary's School for Bengali girls. Here, at last, the long road from Skopje reached its first true destination, a classroom. She taught geography, she taught catechism. She would, in time, teach nearly every subject the curriculum required, because a mission school, with limited staff, asks its sisters to be capable of many things, and Sister Teresa proved capable of nearly all of them. The girls of St. Mary's, many of them poor by any measure Skopje would have recognized, many of them from Calcutta's own vast population of the struggling and the overlooked, found in their new teacher someone unusually patient, unusually warm, unusually attentive to the ones who fell behind or sat quietly at the back of the room. Sister Teresa was, by every account that survives from those years, a beloved teacher, not merely competent, beloved. The girls who passed through her classroom in Entally in the 1930s remembered her long afterward, remembered her kindness, remembered the way she seemed to notice the child no one else noticed. It is a small thing to say of a woman who would later be venerated across the globe, that she was a good and kind schoolteacher, but it is not a small thing at all. It is, in fact, the whole pattern of her life in miniature, attention given fully to whoever stood in front of her, however unremarkable the setting, however unrecorded the moment. She made her final, permanent vows as a sister of Loreto on May 24, 1937, again in Darjeeling, binding herself forever to poverty, chastity, and obedience within the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary. By this time she had been in India for 8 years. She had risen, within the convent's own structure, to positions of real responsibility, and in time she would become principal of St. Mary's School itself, entrusted not merely with a classroom, but with the formation of the whole institution's students, a measure of the trust the Loreto sisters had placed in the quiet, capable young woman who had arrived among them speaking almost no English less than a decade before. By any ordinary measure the story could have ended here, or rather continued here, steadily, for the rest of a long and quietly fruitful life. A devoted teaching sister, well loved by her students, respected by her superiors, given increasing responsibility within a solid and established congregation, this alone would have been a life well spent, a life the gospel would recognize and bless. Calcutta's Loreto convent walls held gardens and relative comfort by the standards of the city outside them, and the settled rhythm of bells and prayers and classes that had shaped Sister Teresa's days for nearly 2 decades. She had every reason, every worldly reason, to believe this was the whole of what God had asked of her, to leave Skopje, to cross the world, to become a good teacher of poor girls in a foreign land, and to remain exactly there, faithful and unremarkable, until death. But the walls of Loreto and Tali, however peaceful, could not fully shut out what lay beyond them. Calcutta in these years was a city groaning under a weight of suffering that no convent garden, however carefully tended, could entirely mute. Bengal was approaching a famine that would kill by the millions. Refugees, driven by forces no one inside the convent controlled, were beginning to fill the streets in numbers that would soon become unbearable to see and impossible to ignore. Sister Teresa, principal now, respected now, settled now into a religious life she had crossed continents to join, could look out from the convent's windows and see it all, and did. The road from Skopje to Calcutta had taken nearly a decade, a train, a ship, a new language, a new name. It had asked her to leave her mother on a platform and never see her again. It had asked for everything she had, and she had given it gladly, believing this classroom, this school, this quiet, faithful teaching life was the whole of the answer God required. It was not yet the whole answer. Something more was coming, and it would come, of all places, on another train. One more journey layered atop all the journeys that had brought her this far. One more moment when God would ask Sister Teresa to give up what she had built in order to receive what she had not yet imagined. The train left Calcutta's Sealdah station in the grey hour before the heat of the day took hold, bound north for the hill station of Darjeeling, where the Loreto sisters kept a house for retreat and where Sister Teresa was going, that September of 1946, to renew her vows. She was 36 years old, a geography teacher and headmistress at St. Mary's, a woman whose religious life for nearly 2 decades had run inside the ordered rhythms of the Loreto order, bells for prayer, bells for class, the long, cool corridors of Italy, the girls of good family and the girls of no family at all, who came to her for lessons and for something more than lessons. She had loved that life. She would say so later, without apology, the way a person speaks of a marriage that was real even though it ended. But something was pressing on her that morning as the train pulled out of the station and began its slow climb toward the mountains, and by the time it reached its destination, she was no longer the same woman who had boarded it. She never described, in any account that survives, the precise words she heard, or whether she heard words at all in the way we mean when we say a person spoke. What she said, years afterward, when her sisters and her confessors pressed her for the story because they needed to understand the ground their own vocations stood on, was that she received on that train a call within the call, a further instruction laid over the one she had already answered as a girl in Skopje. The first call had brought her out of her father's house and across the sea, into Loreto, into the classroom, into the black habit and white coif of a teaching sister. This second call asked something Loreto had not asked and could not give. It asked her to leave the convent walls, not the vocation, not the vows, but the enclosure itself, and go into the slums of Calcutta to live among the poorest of the poor, to serve Christ in his distressing disguise where he was most hidden and most neglected. She would later put a plain sentence on it, the kind of sentence that carries the whole freight of a life in a handful of words. I heard the call to give up even Loreto, where I was very happy, and to go out in the streets to serve the poorest of the poor. The missionaries of charity have kept the date. They mark September 10th every year as Inspiration Day, and they mean by it something more than an anniversary. They mean the hinge on which the entire congregation turns, the moment their mother stopped being simply a good and gifted religious sister and became a founder, though 4 years of waiting still lay between that morning on the train and the day she could act on what she had heard. Because that is the part of the story too easily skipped past, in the retelling, when we already know how it ends and want to hurry to Nirmal Hriday and the first orphans and the sari with the blue border. She heard the call in September 1946. She did not step outside the convent gate to begin her work until August 1948. The Vatican did not grant the decree establishing the Missionaries of Charity as a new religious congregation until October 1950. Between the hearing and the founding lay years of a young woman's certainty running up against the patient, deliberate, sometimes maddening slowness of the Church's discernment, and she submitted to every hour of it because she understood something that the urgency of her own heart could not overrule. A call from God, however clear, must be tested and confirmed by the Church he founded, or it is not obedience at all, but only enthusiasm wearing obedience clothes. The first person she had to convince was her spiritual director in Calcutta, a Jesuit priest named Father Celeste van Exem, and he did not make it easy for her, not because he doubted her sincerity, but because he took the matter seriously enough to doubt everything else, his own judgment most of all. She came to him in the weeks after Darjeeling and told him what she believed she had heard, and he did what a wise director does. He neither dismissed it nor rushed to bless it. He asked her to write it down. He asked her to pray further. He watched her, through the months that followed, for the ordinary fruits that distinguish a true call from a passing fervor, patience under delay, obedience to her superiors in the meantime, a peace that did not curdle into impatience when the answer she wanted was slow in coming. She gave him all of it. She kept teaching at St. Mary's. She kept the horarium of Loreto exactly as she had kept it before the train, rising before dawn, walking her class lines, correcting examination papers by lamplight, giving no outward sign to the sisters around her that anything at all had shifted in the ground beneath her feet. Only Father Van Exem knew. For the better part of 2 years, the fire she carried had exactly one witness on earth who understood what it was. Van Exem, in time, became convinced, and he carried the matter to the man whose word would decide everything, Ferdinand Perrier, the Jesuit Archbishop of Calcutta, a careful and by all accounts somewhat cautious churchman who held in his hands the authority either to open the door Sister Teresa believed God had shown her or to close it. Perrier's caution was not cruelty. A bishop who grants every request from every sister who believes she has heard a voice would soon have no order left in his diocese and no way to distinguish true reform from private eccentricity. He questioned her. He waited. He required her to write out, in her own hand, an account of what had happened on the train and what she believed it required of her, a document the Church would keep, because documents outlast memory, and because a bishop responsible before God for the souls under his care does not act on a feeling, even a feeling reported by a woman, as evidently holy as this one. Perrier took his time. He also took, in the end, her side. What moved him, what moves anyone charged with testing a vocation, was not eloquence, but constancy. Sister Teresa did not campaign. She did not enlist allies to pressure the archbishop, did not sulk or grow cold toward her Loreto superiors during the waiting, did not treat the delay as an injustice to be endured until she could finally be free of it. She waited the way a person waits who trusts that the hand testing her is the same hand that called her, and that the test itself is part of the call, not an obstacle to it. This is worth sitting with, because it is where so many souls with a real vocation lose their way, not in hearing the voice, but in refusing the patience that proves the voice was real. Mother would say, later, watching young sisters of her own strain against the discipline of formation, that God does not need our speed, He needs our fidelity. She had learned that lesson first, as the one being tested, long before she became the one doing the testing. Perrier, satisfied at last that what he was looking at was not a passing restlessness but a genuine and specific call, sent the case forward to Rome, because a request of this kind, a religious sister asking to leave the enclosure of her order, not to abandon vowed life, but to live it in a wholly new form, unprotected by convent walls, out among the destitute of a city's worst slums, required the Holy See's own permission. Rome, too, took its time, and rightly so. The Church has buried too many good intentions that lack staying power to grant such requests lightly. But on April 12, 1948, Pope Pius XII, through the offices that handle such matters, granted Sister Teresa an indult permitting her to leave the Loreto convent while retaining her vows as a religious, so that she might pursue her new work under the direct authority of the Archbishop of Calcutta. It was not yet a new congregation, it was permission to begin. A single sister, released from enclosure, sent out to see what God would do with her. She left St. Mary's that August. The parting from Loreto was not bitter, though it cost her something real. She had given that order 18 years, and the sisters and the girls she had taught had been, in every ordinary sense, her family. She exchanged the black and white Loreto habit for a plain white cotton sari, with 3 blue stripes at the border, the kind worn by the poorest women of Bengal, chosen precisely because it marked no status and asked for no deference, a sari that cost only a few rupees, the cheapest cloth a woman in Calcutta could decently wear. She added a small crucifix pinned at the shoulder. She was, from that August morning onward, no longer Sister Teresa of the Loreto order in any visible sense a passerby on the street could recognize. She looked like what she had chosen to become, one poor woman among the poor of Calcutta, indistinguishable at a glance from the destitute she had come to serve. Before she went to the slums, though, she went to Patna, 300 miles northwest, to spend several months with the medical mission sisters because Archbishop Perrier and Father Van Exem had insisted, with good sense, that a woman about to nurse the dying and the diseased in the worst quarters of a great city needed more than zeal. She needed a working knowledge of medicine, hygiene, the treatment of wounds and the danger signs of the illnesses she would meet daily. She learned to deliver babies. She learned to dress infected sores, to recognize the early signs of tuberculosis and cholera and leprosy, to keep herself and the wound both clean, in conditions where cleanliness was the hardest resource of all to come by. The sisters at Patna offered her, in the end, more than training. They offered to let her stay, to join their own community and its established medical apostolate, a life that would have been secure and useful and entirely reasonable. She declined. Calcutta was calling her back, and the poor she had seen from the convent windows at St. Mary's, the poor of Motishil slum pressed against the very wall of the school where she had taught geography for years without yet being permitted to step through the gate and go to them. Those were the ones she had been sent for, and no other poor, however real their need, would answer to the specific shape of the call she had received on the train. She returned to Calcutta in December 1948 and moved into a small room offered to her by the Little Sisters of the Poor, and then, soon after, found a modest space of her own. Alone at first, entirely alone, a single woman of 38, in a white saree, with no income, no community, no institutional shelter beyond Archbishop Perrier's permission, and a small stipend that ran out quickly, she began. She went into the slum called Motishil and gathered a handful of children off the street, sat them on the ground, and taught them their letters by scratching in the dirt with a stick, because she had no chalk and no blackboard and no schoolroom, only her voice and her patience and the same vocation for teaching that had made her, for 18 years, one of the finest headmistresses in Bengal, turned now to pupils who owned nothing, taught in a language of dirt and a stick instead of desks and slates. She visited the sick in their huts. She begged medicine from pharmacies and bandages from hospitals. She wrote later that in those first weeks she often wondered whether she had made a terrible mistake, whether the security of Loreto had been the very peace God intended for her, and she had thrown it away chasing a feeling on a train, the kind of doubt any honest founder faces once the romance of the calling gives way to the plain grinding difficulty of the work itself. She did not turn back. She kept going out each morning into the slum, and slowly, one household at a time, Calcutta's poorest began to trust the white sari woman who came without money and without condescension, asking nothing but to be allowed to help. It was not long before others noticed her, first curious onlookers, then, within months, young women who had known her as a teacher or heard of her through the Calcutta parishes, who came asking to join what she was doing. The first was a former student of hers named Subhashini Das, who took the name Sister Agnes. Others followed soon after. By 1949, she had a small handful of companions living with her in rented rooms, sharing the same poverty they had chosen to enter, rising before dawn for mass and prayer, and then walking out together into the slums to teach, to nurse, to sit with the dying. What had begun as one woman's answer to a call heard on a train was becoming, without any campaign or announcement, a community, and a community of that kind, in the Church's careful order, cannot remain informal forever. It must be recognized, structured, given rules, and a rule, placed under proper authority, or it risks dissolving the moment its founder's own strength gives out. Archbishop Perrier, watching this small band take shape through 1949 and into 1950, judged that the time for a formal congregation had come, and he petitioned Rome accordingly. On October 7, 1950, the Holy See granted its approval, and the Missionaries of Charity came into being as a diocesan religious congregation of the Archdiocese of Calcutta, a community of women vowed to poverty, chastity, obedience, and a fourth vow unique to this new order, wholehearted free service to the poorest of the poor. Mother Teresa, for she was mother now, superior of a congregation, though she would spend the rest of her life resisting every honor that came attached to that title, had, in 4 years, 4 months, and 27 days from the morning the train left Sealda station, seen the call within the call become a church, small as a mustard seed and, like the mustard seed of the parable, containing within it everything it would ever need to grow. It is worth pausing, before this story moves on to Nirmal Hriday and the dying of Calcutta, on what those 4 years actually prove. They were not an obstacle Mother Teresa had to overcome to get to the real work. They were part of the real work, the part hidden from the public eye, in which a soul convinced of her own vocation nonetheless placed that conviction entirely into the Church's hands and let churchmen far more cautious than she was test it, delay it, and finally confirm it. She never once, in any letter or account that survives from those waiting years, suggested that the delay was an injustice or that she knew better than her superiors. She trusted that the same voice she had heard on the train to Darjeeling was capable of moving an archbishop's pen and a pope's seal in its own good time, and it did. The pencil, as she would later say of herself, does not decide when it will be picked up. It waits in the hand that holds it, and it writes when it is time to write. September 10, 1946 was the day she was picked up. The years after were the sharpening. What came next was the writing itself, in ink that would not fade. The woman lay on the pavement outside Campbell Hospital, and she was already being eaten by the street. Ants had found the wounds on her feet. Dogs had come close enough to sniff before someone chased them off. Mother knelt down in the filth of Lower Circular Road, gathered her up, and carried her through the hospital doors herself, because no one else would. The hospital would not take her. There was no bed, the attendant said, and no family to claim her if she died, and no money to pay for care that would only end in a death certificate. Mother did not argue. She had learned by then that arguing with a shut door rarely opens it. She carried the woman back outside and sat with her on the pavement, held her, and stayed until she died in her arms, not in a doorway, not alone, but held by someone who had chosen, in that hour, to be the whole of her family. It was not the first time. It would not be the last. But something in that particular afternoon settled into Mother like a stone dropped into still water, sending out rings that did not stop moving. Calcutta's dying did not lack for compassion exactly. There were hospitals, there were missions, there were kind strangers who paused. What the city's dying lacked was somewhere to be received, not treated, necessarily. Many of them were past treating, received. Somewhere a door opened rather than closed, where a body covered in sores could be washed rather than avoided, where a woman with no name anyone knew could be called by name in her last hour because someone had troubled to ask her what it was. Mother went to the authorities. She had done this before, over and over, in the 2 years since she had begun walking the slums, with nothing but her sari and her resolve, asking, petitioning, standing in offices until someone with the power to say yes finally did. This time she went to the health officer of the Calcutta Corporation and asked for a place, any place, somewhere the dying of the city could be brought and cared for until God took them. What the corporation offered her was strange, and it was perfect, and it could only have come from a God with a sense of how mercy actually moves through a broken world. Behind the great temple of Kali at Kaligat, the goddess of destruction and transformation, worshipped by thousands of Hindu pilgrims every year, there stood a dharmashala, a resting house, built for pilgrims who came from far away to worship at the shrine. It had fallen into disuse. It was, in its way, already sacred ground, already a place where the weary came to rest before something larger than themselves. The corporation gave it to her. In August of 1952, Mother opened its doors and called it Nirmal Hridaya, pure heart. She meant the words literally, not as decoration. Every person carried through that door would be treated as though their heart, however ravaged the body around it, was pure and precious and worth the whole of her attention. She did not build Nirmal Hridaya to cure Calcutta's dying. She built it so that no one in Calcutta would die uncared for, unwashed, unnamed, unloved, die, as she put it, like an animal in a gutter when they were made, every one of them, in the image of God. The city did not receive this gift the way she had hoped. Word spread through the neighborhood around the temple that a Christian nun had set up a house for the dying of every disease, dying of every religion, dying without regard for caste or cleanliness, inside the sacred precincts of Kali herself. To some of the priests and pilgrims who came to worship, this felt like a violation. A foreign woman, bringing the diseased and the untouchable into the shadow of the goddess. Stones were thrown at the building, threats were made. There were mutterings that she meant to convert the dying with her ministrations, that this was missionary strategy wearing the mask of mercy, that she ought to be driven out before she did more damage than good. The corporation, hearing the unrest, sent its health officer to investigate, to see for himself what was actually happening inside those walls, and to decide whether the complaints against her held weight enough to close her down. He walked into Nirmal Hridaya prepared, perhaps, to find something to justify shutting the door on her work. What he found instead was Mother on her knees on the stone floor, cleaning the wounds of a man dying of gangrene, wounds so far gone that the smell alone had driven away every other soul willing to go near him. She did not look up right away. She finished what she was doing first. When she did look up, there was no plea in her face, no defensiveness, only the plain fact of the work itself laid out for him to see. He went back outside to the crowd that had gathered, the ones demanding she be removed, and he told them, according to the account that has been carried down inside the family of the missionaries of charity ever since, that he would remove her from Kalighat gladly. All they needed to do was find him mothers and sisters, women from their own families, willing to do what she was doing with their own hands. Until they could produce even one, she would stay. No one came forward. The stones stopped. It is worth sitting with what actually happened in that exchange, because it is the whole of her method in miniature. She did not defend herself with an argument about religious liberty or municipal law. She did not need to. The work spoke, because the work was simply love made visible in the most unanswerable way. A woman kneeling over a stranger's ruined body, asking nothing in return. Against that, opposition eventually runs out of things to say. Inside Nirmal Hridaya, the discipline she had carried since the day she first knelt in the gutter over a dying woman on Motichil Road only sharpened. She did not walk the wards of Kalighat thinking in terms of the dying, plural, a category, a crisis to be managed. She could not have sustained the work if she had. The numbers alone would have crushed her, the endless arriving stretchers, the small bodies wrapped in newspaper because there had been nothing else to wrap them in. What sustained her, what she taught every sister who came to kneel beside her, was smaller and harder and more durable than any grand vision. One person, in front of you, right now. Wash this face, hold this hand, learn this name, if there is a name to learn, and if there is not, give one, because everyone who dies in Nirmal Hridaya dies as somebody, never as a case number on a corporation ledger. She called what she saw in each of those faces the distressing disguise, Christ himself, hidden inside the wreckage of a body no one else would touch, exactly as he had promised in the Gospel of Matthew. Whatever you do to the least of these, you do to me. She did not treat this as poetry. She treated it as fact, as literally true as the stone floor beneath her knees, and she trained her sisters to treat it the same way. You were not, in her theology, doing something generous for a stranger when you bathed a dying man's wounds at Nirmal Hridaya. You were bathing Christ. The dying man was the veil. Christ was underneath it, waiting, as he always had been, to be recognized by someone willing to look past the smell and the sores and the silence. There is a story told and retold inside the missionaries of charity of a man carried into Nirmal Hridaya in the last stage of some wasting disease, his body already half given over to maggots, brought in by neighbors who wanted him gone from their doorstep more than they wanted him saved. Mother cleaned him herself. She stayed with him through what remained of his hours, and before he died, by every account that has come down through the sisters who were present, he said to her, not with bitterness, but with something closer to wonder, that he had lived on the street like an animal, but because of what she had done for him, he would die like an angel, loved and cared for. That sentence, spoken by a dying stranger to a woman who had known him for less than a day, is as close as anything to the whole purpose of Nirmal Harai laid bare. She had not cured him. She could not cure anyone. What she had given him was the dignity of being received, of mattering, at the very end, to someone. She did not stop at the dying. Calcutta's wounds ran in every direction, and once the door of Nirmal Harai had opened, other doors began to open with it, each one answering a face she had actually seen rather than a policy she had drawn up in advance. The infants came next. In the slums and on the steps of churches and, more often than either, in the city's dustbins, newborns were being abandoned, girls especially, unwanted, unaffordable, born into families with no way to feed one more mouth. Mother had seen enough of these small bodies, some living and some not, to know that the city needed a second kind of door, one that opened not at the end of life, but at its very beginning. In 1955, she opened Shishu Bhavan, a home for abandoned and orphaned children, taking in infants left to die and giving them instead cots and milk and sisters who would hold them the way a mother holds a child, because to Mother that is precisely what they had. She had simply expanded who counted as family. Word of Shishu Bhavan moved through Calcutta the way word of Nirmal Harai had, and soon babies were being left not in dustbins but on the doorstep of the home itself, because even people who could not keep a child had come to believe that this particular door, at least, would not turn one away. It rarely did. And then came the lepers, of everyone in Calcutta, who suffered. None suffered a more total exile than those marked by leprosy. It was not only the disease that isolated them, the numbness, the disfigurement, the slow loss of fingers and toes, and sometimes sight. It was what the disease did to how the rest of the city saw them. Lepers were driven from their families, banned from markets, forced into colonies on the edges of the city where they begged from a safe distance because no one would come near enough to hand them anything directly. They were, in the truest sense of a phrase Mother used again and again, among the poorest of the poor, not simply materially destitute, but stripped of the one thing every human being needs more than bread, which is to be looked at without flinching. She went to them the way she had gone to everyone else, in person, on foot, with her own hands, refusing the fear that kept the rest of the city at a distance. She began mobile clinics, carrying medicine and bandages out to where the leprosy patients lived because they could not come to her. The work grew large enough and urgent enough that it needed more than a van and a handful of sisters carrying supplies through the slums. The help came, in the end, from an unlikely direction. When Pope Paul VI visited India in 1964, he gave Mother the white car he had ridden in during his visit, a gesture of simple generosity toward a woman whose work had already reached Rome's attention. Mother did not keep it for a single day. She raffled it, turning a pope's gift into the funds that let her build something permanent for the people the rest of the city refused to touch, a settlement outside Calcutta at Titagarh where leprosy patients could live, be treated, work, and raise their children away from the daily cruelty of exile. She named it Shanti Nagar, the town of peace, because peace, more than a cure, was the thing its residents had been denied the longest. She had a phrase for the leprosy patients that she repeated so often it became something close to a teaching in itself: touch the leper with your compassion. Not with medicine alone, not with distance kept safe by a mask and gloves, but with your hands, your presence, your willingness to be near a body the rest of the world had decided was untouchable. She meant it as instruction to her sisters, but she lived it first, the way she lived every discipline she asked of them. By the time Shanti Nagar was standing and Shishu Bhavan was full of children who would otherwise have died nameless, Nirmal Harai had already become something larger than a single house behind a temple in Kalegup. It had become the pattern for everything that followed, the proof, tested and retested against real bodies and real deaths and real opposition thrown at her in the form of stones, that mercy does not need a program to move through the world. It needs a person, and then another person, and then another, received one at a time, seen one face at a time, loved not as a category of suffering, but as a soul with a name. She never let the scale of the need talk her out of the size of her method. Calcutta held millions who suffered, and she could not save Calcutta. She could kneel over one dying man on a stone floor and wash his wounds until he was ready to meet God. She could hold one infant left on a doorstep until it stopped crying. She could sit with one leprosy patient long enough that he remembered what it felt like to be touched without disgust. She did this again, and again, and again, for the whole of her life, and in the doing of it, one face at a time, the whole of Calcutta's suffering, impossibly, began to be answered. There is a locked box of letters that Mother asked, more than once, to be burned. They were not burned. Her spiritual directors kept them, against her explicit wish, because they understood, long before the rest of the world would, that these pages held something the Church would need. When the cause for her canonization opened, the letters were given to Father Brian Kaladiachuk, and through his patient work, the world finally read what Mother Teresa had spent nearly 50 years hiding behind that famous smile. A darkness so total that she once told her confessor she feared, if she ever became a saint, she would surely be a saint of darkness. She would be gone from earth a long, long time before anyone outside a small circle of priests knew that the woman who radiated such certainty to the world was, within her own soul, walking through what felt like an empty house with every light put out. This is the part of her story that unsettles people who meet her for the first time. It should not. It is, in fact, the part that proves everything else. The darkness did not come at the start. In the early years after Inspiration Day, the years of the little school, under the tree in Madachul, the first novices, the first rescued children, Mother's interior life was, by her own account, rich with consolation. She heard Christ's voice with a clarity she described to Archbishop Perrier as unmistakable. She felt his thirst, his love for the poor, his call to her personally, and she felt it the way you feel warmth from a fire you are standing beside. That fire is what carried her out of Loreto and into the slums. It is what let her beg for rice with a joy that startled the merchants of Calcutta. And then, not long after the missionaries of charity took their first vows in 1950, the fire seemed to go out. She described it to her directors in language that still stops the breath of anyone who reads it slowly. The silence, she said, was terrible. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of absence, as if God, who had spoken to her so plainly on the train to Darjeeling and in the chapel at Entally, had simply stopped. She used the word darkness again and again, because no gentler word would do. She told Archbishop Perrier that when she tried to lift her mind to God in prayer, there was nothing there to lift it to, no sense of his presence, no felt love, no answering warmth. She said that heaven, which she had once known as near as her own heartbeat, now meant nothing to her at all, that the thought of it left her cold. She wrote of a terrible sense of loss, of feeling unwanted, unloved, empty to the point of physical pain. And this is the sentence that has broken open the hearts of readers who love her. She wrote of moments in which she doubted the very existence of God, not with her will, not with her mind, which held the truths of the faith as firmly as ever, but in the lower rooms of her soul, in the place where feeling lives. There was nothing to confirm what she believed. She believed in the dark, without a single candle to show her the path was still there. Anyone who has sat with a grieving person or waited alone in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m. for news knows something of what she meant. Now imagine that condition, not for a season, but for the better part of 5 decades. Imagine carrying it while founding a religious order from nothing, while walking into the worst slums on earth to pick up the dying, while standing before cardinals and presidents and journalists with a face that showed nothing but peace. That is what Mother Teresa did. It helps to understand when this darkness began, because the timing is not accidental. It settled over her soul in earnest in the years immediately following her decision to leave Loreto, the very years in which she was, at last, doing exactly what Christ had asked of her on the train. She had said yes to the call within the call. She had traded the security of the convent for the risk of the street, and it was there, in the fullness of her obedience, that the felt presence of the one who had called her seemed to vanish entirely. She did not hide this from everyone. She could not have survived it if she had. She wrote of it, in painful and searching detail, to 2 men above all, Archbishop Ferdinand Perrier of Calcutta, who guided her through the founding years, and later Father Joseph Noynier, a Jesuit theologian, to whom she turned in the 1960s when the weight of the darkness had grown almost unbearable. It was Father Noynier who gave her at last the words she needed to understand what was happening to her, and it is worth sitting with his counsel, because it is the theological key to this entire chapter of her life. Father Neuner told her that what she was experiencing was not a loss of faith. It was not a sign that God had abandoned her, or that her vocation had been a mistake, or that the voice she had heard on the train to Darjeeling had been an illusion. He told her, instead, that this darkness was itself a gift, the spiritual side of her work among the poor. The missionaries of charity had been founded to share not only in the material poverty of the poorest of the poor, but in their poverty of spirit, their sense of being unwanted, unloved, uncared for by God and man alike. If Mother was to carry Christ's love to people who felt utterly abandoned, Father Neuner reasoned, it made a terrible and beautiful sense that she herself would be asked to feel that abandonment from the inside. She could not hand the poor a love she had only read about. She would have to hand them a love that had walked, personally, through the very darkness they lived in. Something in Mother settled when she heard this. It did not remove the suffering, nothing removed the suffering, not for the rest of her life, but it gave the suffering a shape she could carry. She began, from that point forward, to understand her darkness not as the opposite of her calling, but as its continuation. The same Christ who had said, "I thirst," from the cross, who had cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me," in the hour of his own abandonment, was inviting her to stand beside him in that exact cry, not as an observer, not as a devotee reading about it from a safe distance, as a participant. She was not merely serving a Christ who had once suffered abandonment 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem. She was living, in her own soul, a small and continuing echo of that same abandonment, and in doing so, she was drawing closer to him than any amount of felt consolation could ever have brought her. This is the theological center of everything the missionaries of charity call the distressing disguise. Christ hides himself in the broken body of the man dying in the gutters of Caliphate. That much the world already understood, or thought it understood, from the image of Mother kneeling beside him. What the letters revealed is that Christ was also hiding himself, just as truly, in the empty silence of Mother's own prayer. The poor she served felt unloved by God. In the deepest chamber of her heart, so, for decades, did she. She had not simply chosen to serve the poorest of the poor. She had, without asking for it, been made one of them, poor not in body, for she never wanted for the crust of bread she required, but poor in the one thing she had built her entire life around, the felt nearness of God. It is worth saying plainly what this darkness was not, because the world has a way of taking a saint's suffering and shrinking it into something smaller and more fashionable. This was not depression in the clinical sense, though it shared some of that condition's weight. This was not a crisis of faith that left her uncertain what to believe, because her adherence to the teaching of the Church, to the reality of the Eucharist, to the truth of Christ's love, never wavered for an instant in her will or her intellect. And this was most certainly not doubt, as the modern world understands doubt, a shrug, a walking away, a quiet abandonment of practice. Mother Teresa attended Mass every single day of those 50 years. She spent an hour in adoration before the Blessed Sacrament every single day, kneeling in a chapel that, by her own account, often felt to her like an empty room. She wrote letters describing the emptiness in one breath and, in the next, renewed her vows, wrote new constitutions for her sisters, and walked out the door to find a dying man on the pavement. Whatever this darkness was, it never once stopped her hand from moving toward the poor. That is the detail that should silence any temptation to read this chapter as a scandal or a tragedy. A person in genuine crisis of faith stops. Mother never stopped. The darkness ran alongside her fidelity for 50 years like a shadow that never once slowed her feet. She hid it, as we have said, from nearly everyone. Her own sisters, who lived with her daily, who watched her pray and lead and laugh, had almost no idea. She wore what she herself called a mask, not out of deception, but out of a fierce conviction that her own suffering was hers to carry, not theirs to be burdened with, and that the poor she served deserved a face that gave them hope, not a face that mirrored their own despair. She told one of her directors that she wanted the poor to see in her a reflection of God's tenderness, and if her own soul was too dark to feel that tenderness, she would still give it to them with her hands and her voice, whatever it cost her. That costing is not a small thing to say about a person. It is, when you sit with it, one of the more staggering acts of love in the modern history of the Church, to give warmth you do not feel, day after day, to strangers who need it more than you need relief from your own cold. None of this was new in the life of the saints. though it startled a world that had grown used to thinking of holiness as a kind of serene immunity to suffering. St. John of the Cross wrote of the dark night of the soul 4 centuries before Mother Teresa lived it, and named in it a real and necessary stage of the soul's journey toward God, a stripping away of every consolation so that what remains is love purified of every comfort but the Beloved himself. Saint Thérèse of Lisieux, whose little-way mother had admired since her novitiate, endured her own final agony of unbelief in the last 18 months of her short life, doubting even the existence of the heaven she had spent her whole life longing for. Mother Teresa's darkness belongs in that company. It is not an aberration in the history of holiness. It is, if the tradition is to be trusted, one of its deepest and most reliable marks, the sign that a soul has been brought so close to God that even the memory of feeling Him near has been taken away, so that only the naked act of the will, choosing Him for His own sake and not for the comfort of His presence, remains. That is what Mother Teresa's 50 years of darkness ask us to understand about love. Love that only shows up when it feels good is not yet love in its fullest form. It is affection, and affection is a fine and human thing, but it is not the love that carries a person into a house of the dying at dawn, day after day, decade after decade, with no promise that today will feel any different than yesterday's silence. Mother's love had long since stopped depending on feeling anything at all. It had become, instead, an act of the will offered new every single morning. I choose you, even now, even here, even though you have hidden your face from me. And that kind of love, offered without reward, without consolation, without even the comfort of certainty in the felt sense, is very close to the love the cross itself asks of every Christian who has ever stood beneath it. She never wanted the letters read. She asked, plainly, that they be destroyed, because she believed her darkness was between herself and God alone, and because she feared, with the humility that marked everything she did, that people would think more of her suffering than of the God she suffered for. But the Church kept the letters, and in keeping them gave the rest of us something we badly needed, proof that the woman on the holy card, the woman with the folded hands and the serene gaze, had walked through a desert as real and as long as any desert a struggling believer has ever crossed. She did not walk through it because her faith was weak. She walked through it because her faith and the love built upon it had grown strong enough to carry weight that would have broken a smaller soul entirely. The smile the world saw was real. It was simply not born of feeling. It was born of will and of obedience and of a decision made and remade every morning in a nearly silent chapel to love God and to love the poor in His distressing disguise, whether or not love, that day, felt like anything at all. The lights would not work. That was the trouble the BBC crew ran into in the spring of 1969, deep inside Nirmal Harid, trying to film the long, dim hall where Mother Teresa's sisters knelt beside the dying. The building had almost no windows. The film stock they had brought was fast, but not fast enough, and the cameraman told Malcolm Muggeridge, the journalist who had come to Calcutta to interview her, that the footage would almost certainly come back black. It did not come back black. When the film was developed, the hall glowed, soft, even, luminous, as though lit by a source no lamp in the room could account for. The cameraman, a professional with no stake in miracles, said he had never seen anything like it. Muggeridge, who was on his way to belief but had not yet arrived, called it a technical accident that no technician could explain, and let his viewers draw their own conclusions. He would go on, within a few years, to enter the Catholic Church, and he would say more than once that Calcutta had a great deal to do with it. He titled the documentary, and the book that followed it, Something Beautiful for God, words he had heard from her own mouth, spoken about the poor she knelt beside every day. The phrase was hers before it was his. Everything that mattered in that broadcast was hers before it was the world's. Up to that year, the world had not much noticed her. She had been at her work for nearly 20 years, the Home for the Dying, open since 1952, Shishu Bhavan, taking in abandoned children, the missionaries of charity, growing quietly from 12 sisters to hundreds, spreading from Calcutta into other cities in India, and then, in 1965, beyond India altogether, to Venezuela. She had done all of it in the particular obscurity of the poor, among people the rest of the world walked past without seeing. She had not sought a camera. She had, if anything, resisted one. When Muggeridge first proposed the film, she agreed only because she believed it might help her get more hands and more money to the people who needed them, and for no other reason she ever gave. But the camera found her, And once it had, it could not look away, and neither, soon enough, could the rest of the world. What the world saw, when it finally looked, unsettled it in the best possible way. Here was a face, lined by sun and work, wrapped in a sari of coarse white cotton with 3 blue stripes, standing in streets that most Western viewers had only ever seen photographed as spectacle, the destitute of Calcutta, filmed elsewhere as tragedy or as scandal. She did not stand among them as spectacle. She knelt among them as family. She washed the sores of strangers with the same unhurried tenderness a mother gives a child's scraped knee, and she looked directly into the camera when asked, and said what she had always said to anyone who asked, that she saw Christ in every person she touched, in his distressing disguise, and that there was nothing complicated about her work at all, only love, offered one person at a time. Reporters who came to Calcutta expecting an organization found instead a woman on her knees. Diplomats who came expecting a spokesperson for a cause found instead someone who would speak of nothing but souls. She never adjusted the message for the size of the audience. She gave the Sunday Times correspondent the same words she gave a dying man on a stretcher on the floor of Nirmal Hriday, that he was somebody, that he was loved, that God had not forgotten him. The world, hungry for something it could not quite name, recognized in this a kind of honesty it had nearly stopped expecting from anyone standing in front of a lens. Invitations began arriving from places that had never sent her so much as a letter. Governments wanted her present at their functions. Universities wanted to grant her degrees. Foundations wanted to give her prizes, and, more usefully, in her accounting, prize money. She accepted almost every invitation that put her within reach of someone who might help the poor, and she turned down almost every comfort that came attached to the invitation. She would fly economy when a benefactor offered first class, sleep on the floor of a convent guest room when a 5-star hotel had been booked in her name, and hand back gift baskets of fruit and sweets to be distributed among people who had nothing at all. Bishops learned quickly that if they wanted to honor her, the honor had to be functional, a check, a building, a plane ticket for 2 more sisters, because anything ornamental she would simply give away before the day was out. In 1971, Pope Paul VI awarded her the first Pope John XXIII Peace Prize, and the money that came with it went straight into her work among lepers. In 1979, the Nobel Committee in Oslo did something it had rarely done for a nun, a missionary, a woman who ran no state and commanded no army. It awarded her the Nobel Peace Prize, the highest honor the secular world knows how to give, for work that was, in the end, entirely religious in its motive and its meaning. She nearly refused to attend the ceremony. It was not modesty exactly, though there was modesty in it. It was that the customary Nobel banquet, the formal dinner that traditionally follows the award, with its courses and its toasts and its considerable expense, struck her as precisely the kind of money that ought to go to people who had not eaten that day. She asked the committee to cancel the banquet and give her the funds instead. They agreed. The money that would have paid for one evening's hospitality for dignitaries in Oslo went instead to feed several thousand of the poorest people in Calcutta for a year. It was, in its way, her acceptance speech before she had even given the one she stood up to deliver, and when she did stand at the podium in Oslo City Hall, in her white and blue sari, small and stooped among the furs and formal dress of the assembled dignitaries, she did not talk about geopolitics or peace treaties or the machinery of the Cold War that had brought most Nobel laureates before her to that stage. She talked about abortion, calling it the greatest destroyer of peace in the world, because a mother who could kill her own child had nothing left inside her to stop her from killing anyone at all. She talked about the family, about the poor, about loneliness in the wealthiest countries on earth being a poverty as severe as any she had found in Calcutta's gutters. She led the entire hall, kings, diplomats, journalists, laureates, in reciting the peace prayer of St. Francis, a room full of people who had gathered for statecraft, finding themselves instead praying aloud for the grace to be an instrument of peace. She did not perform humility for the room. She simply brought the room, gently and without apology, into her own world, and for those minutes it was the room that had to adjust. That was, in fact, the pattern that held for the rest of her life, through every stage and palace and Vatican audience she would ever enter. The world came to her door in the person of presidents and prime ministers, popes and princes, and every single time, without exception, it was she who set the terms of the meeting. Presidents Reagan and Clinton received her in Washington. She used the audience to press for orphanages, for the unborn, for whatever concrete need was closest to hand, and left as unimpressed by the trappings of the White House as she had been unmoved by the poverty she had chosen for herself at the Mother House. She met with Fidel Castro in Cuba, undeterred by ideology, because Castro governed people who were poor and she had sisters who wanted to serve them. The meeting produced, eventually, a Missionaries of Charity house in Havana. She sat with heads of state on both sides of nearly every conflict of her era: India and Pakistan, Israel and the Palestinian territories, apartheid South Africa, and asked each of them, without exception, for the same two things: access to the suffering and a moment's ceasefire, however brief, so that children caught in crossfire could be moved to safety. In Beirut, in 1982, in the middle of a civil war, she crossed the front line to reach a shelter of disabled children trapped under shellfire and evacuated them across the fighting because she had asked both sides to stop shooting long enough to let her pass, and, remarkably, repeatedly, in a dozen conflicts over the years, they did. She met Pope Paul VI, who had already honored her before the world took notice, and later she came to know Pope John Paul II with a closeness that bordered on friendship, two figures from the eastern edge of Europe, she from Skopje, he from Krakow, who understood each other's spiritual seriousness without needing many words to establish it. He visited her sisters and her houses on his travels. She attended him in Rome. When he was shot in 1981, she was among the first to send word of her prayers. When Missionaries of Charity sisters faced difficulties opening houses in various countries, it was sometimes his direct intervention that cleared the way. Theirs was not a relationship of ceremony. It was two people who had each given their whole lives to the same Lord, recognizing that fact in each other and getting on with the work. What is most remarkable about these years of medals and motorcades is not that they happened, but that they changed nothing at all about how she lived. She did not acquire a larger room. The cell she slept in at the Calcutta Mother House, a simple iron bed, a small table, a crucifix on the wall, was the same cell whether she had just returned from Oslo with a gold medal in her bag or from a dying man's bedside 3 streets away. She did not acquire a later schedule. The bell for morning prayer at the Mother House still rang at 4:40, and she was still there, on the floor with her sisters, whether she had been shaking hands with a head of state the evening before or not. She still washed her own clothes by hand in a bucket. She still ate what the sisters ate, at the same table, off the same tin plate. Visitors who came to Calcutta expecting to find the offices of a global institution, flags, staff, a press secretary, found instead a woman doing the wash, or peeling vegetables, or kneeling in the chapel, precisely as she had been doing for 30 years before anyone in Oslo had heard her name. She accepted the Nobel Prize, and the honorary degrees, and the audiences with kings, in the same spirit in which she accepted a donated sack of rice, gratefully, because it could feed someone, and then she went back to work. Fame arrived at her door the way a delivery truck arrives, necessary, sometimes useful, never invited in to stay. She used every ounce of the world's new attention the way she used every rupee that came into her hands, for the poor, and for nothing else. When journalists pressed her, again and again, on how it felt to be called a living saint, she waved the question away with something close to impatience, and turned the subject back to the person she had just visited that morning, who had no bed, no food, no name anyone had bothered to learn. There is a story, told by those who worked alongside her in those years, of a benefactor who arranged an entire wing of comforts for her during a visit to a western city, a suite, a car and driver, a full itinerary of hospitality. She thanked the man with real warmth, because his heart was in the right place, and then quietly asked her sisters to find out where the nearest home for the elderly poor was, and spent the bulk of her free hours there instead, sitting with people nobody had come to see. The comforts prepared for her sat mostly unused. It was not performance. It was simply that comfort had stopped registering to her as something worth the time it cost. What the world was watching, through Muggeridge's camera and the Nobel ceremony and every state visit that followed, was not a woman being transformed by attention into something new. It was a woman who had already been transformed, decades earlier, on a train to Darjeeling and on the floor of a rented room in Motichil, being seen at last for what she had already become. The fame did not make her. It simply made her visible, the way the film crew's lamp had failed to make that hall in Nirmal Hriday visible, until something beyond the equipment supplied the light itself. She would say, when people asked how she managed to stay unchanged amid so much honor, that she was only a pencil in God's hand. A pencil does the writing, she would explain, but it is not the pencil that composes the letter, it only lies still and lets itself be used. The world came to her door with medals and motorcades and the eyes of every nation upon her, and she received all of it the way a pencil receives the hand that holds it, without resistance, and without taking any credit for the words that came out. What the world saw, when the cameras finally caught up to her, was not new. It was only, at last, in the light. On the evening of September 5, 1997, the lights were on in the small chapel at Mother House on Lower Circular Road, and the sisters were praying the rosary the way they had prayed it every evening for decades. Mother had been unwell for weeks, her heart, weakened by years of illness and by a body that had given everything it had, was failing quickly now. She had received the anointing of the sick more than once that year. And on that particular evening, a little after 9 o'clock, with the sisters gathered close, she breathed her last. She was 87 years old. She had spent nearly 70 of those years in religious life, and almost 50 of them serving the poorest of the poor on the streets of Calcutta, and by then in more than 100 countries across the earth. She died the way she had lived, quietly, without ceremony, in the middle of an ordinary evening prayer, surrounded not by cameras, but by her own daughters. There was no deathbed speech. There was no final message crafted for the world. There was only an old woman, worn out from love, going home to the God she had spent a lifetime insisting she could not find. The news reached the streets of Calcutta before it reached most of the world's newsrooms, and the city that had so often been characterized, unfairly, and never by her, as a place of despair, poured into the streets to grieve a woman who had spent her life insisting that Calcutta's poor deserved to be looked at, not looked away from. Hindus, Muslims, Sikhs, and Christians came together to Mother House. Many of them had never met her. Nearly all of them had been touched, in some indirect way, by the small army of women in white and blue who had carried her work into the slums and gutters and dying rooms of their city for half a century. The government of India, which had granted her citizenship decades before and had long since stopped treating her as a foreign curiosity, declared a state funeral. It is an honor India reserves for its own most revered dead, and it had been offered to almost no one who was not a head of state. Mother's body was carried through the streets of Calcutta on the same gun carriage that had once borne the bodies of Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru, the father of the nation and its first prime minister, to their final rest. Sit with that detail a moment, because it says something the world's obituaries did not always manage to say. India did not honor Mother Teresa as a curious foreign visitor who had done some good works among its poor. India honored her as one of its own, a daughter of Calcutta, entitled to the same procession of grief the nation gives its founders. Presidents and prime ministers came, queens came, but so did the poor, in numbers no guest list could contain, lining the roads for miles, many of them weeping for a woman who had picked them up off the pavement, or fed their children, or simply looked them in the eye when no one else would. It is easy, from a distance of years, to remember the state honors and the foreign dignitaries and forget the deeper truth of that funeral. It was, in the end, the poor burying their own mother. There is a strange and telling detail that belongs to that week, one that says something true about how the world receives its saints. Diana, Princess of Wales, had died only 5 days earlier, on August 31st, in a car accident in Paris, and the grief for her was still at its rawest and loudest when Mother died. For a few days the two deaths were spoken of in the same breath by a press that did not always know what to do with either woman, one young, beautiful, and famous in the way the modern world understands fame, the other old, stooped, and famous in a way the modern world had never quite been able to categorize. Diana had visited Mother only months before, in New York, two women from very different worlds finding something to recognize in each other. Some commentators wondered, in that strange week, whether Mother's death would be crowded out of public memory by the enormous, spontaneous outpouring of grief for the princess. It was not. Within days the world turned its full attention back to the small woman in Calcutta, because the truth of a life like hers does not compete for column space, it simply endures. The world had learned, over the decades since Malcolm Muggeridge's 1969 documentary and the Nobel Prize, and the endless photographs of her hands wrapped around the hands of the dying, that this was not a passing story. It was something closer to a permanent fact about the 20th century, that in the middle of it, in one of its poorest cities, a small Albanian nun had shown the whole earth what love looks like when it has nothing left to prove. The Church, for its part, did not wait long to begin the formal process of recognizing what so many already knew in their hearts. Ordinarily, the Church requires 5 years to pass after a candidate's death before the cause for beatification can even open, a waiting period meant to let passions cool and judgment settle. Pope John Paul II, who had known Mother personally, who had prayed with her, who understood, perhaps better than almost anyone alive at the time, what her life had meant not only to the poor of Calcutta but to the conscience of the modern world, took the extraordinary step of waiving that waiting period. The cause opened in 1999, less than 2 years after her death, moving with a speed almost unheard of in the Church's careful, patient processes. The path to sainthood, as the Church understands it, does not run on affection alone. It asks for evidence, a life of heroic virtue examined in painstaking detail, testimonies gathered from those who knew her, and, in accordance with the Church's ancient practice, a miracle, some sign, medically inexplicable, that God has heard the prayers of those who ask for her intercession. The miracle presented for her beatification came from Monica Bezra, a woman in West Bengal suffering from a large tumor in her abdomen. Sisters of the Missionaries of Charity had prayed over her with a medal that had touched Mother's body, invoking her intercession, and Bezra's tumor disappeared. The case was investigated at length, examined by physicians and theologians alike, and it was accepted. On October 19, 2003, Pope John Paul II beatified Mother Teresa in St. Peter's Square before a crowd estimated at 300,000 people, one of the largest gatherings for a beatification in the Church's history. She was given the title Blessed. It was a small word for what the crowd in that square already felt in their bones, that they were not waiting for the Church to decide something uncertain, but watching the Church confirm what the poor of Calcutta, the lepers of Titagar, the dying of Nirmal Hriday, and millions of ordinary believers around the world had already known for years. This was a saint. The formal process was simply the Church's way of saying so out loud, with the care and rigor that so serious a claim deserves. 13 years passed before the second miracle came, and the final step. A Brazilian man named Marcílio Haddad Andrino had been suffering from multiple brain abscesses, a condition that had left him in a coma and that his doctors believed would either kill him or leave him permanently and severely disabled. His wife prayed to Mother Teresa for his healing on the night before he was to undergo emergency surgery. The surgeons, preparing to operate, found upon examination that the abscesses had inexplicably vanished. Andrino recovered fully. The case, like Bezra's before it, underwent years of careful medical and theological scrutiny before it was accepted by the Congregation for the Causes of Saints as a genuine miracle attributable to Mother's intercession. And so, on September 4, 2016, the eve of the 19th anniversary of her death, Pope Francis canonized Mother Teresa of Calcutta in St. Peter's Square. Pause on who filled that square, because it tells you something essential about what kind of saint the Church was declaring her to be. Alongside the cardinals and bishops and the ordinary Roman crowds who gather for every canonization, Pope Francis had arranged for something unusual. Several thousand of the poor, the homeless, and the destitute of Rome were brought to the ceremony as honored guests. They were not spectators watching from a distance. They were seated near the front, given a place of dignity that the world so rarely grants people in their condition, which was, of course, precisely the point, and precisely what Mother herself would have wanted. A woman who had spent her life insisting that the poor deserved to be looked at with love, not pity, was canonized in a square where the poor themselves sat as guests of honor rather than as a symbol gestured toward from a podium. Pope Francis, in his homily that day, spoke of her as a woman who had made her voice heard before the powers of the world so that they might recognize their guilt, the guilt, he said, of the crime of poverty they themselves created. He spoke of her bowing down before those exhausted, left to die on the side of the road, seeing in them the dignity given them by God himself. He called her a generous dispenser of divine mercy, making herself available for everyone through her welcome and defense of human life, unborn and abandoned. And he gave her, from that day forward, the title by which the whole Church would now know her, Saint Teresa of Calcutta. There was a fittingness to the timing that no one in that square could have missed. She had died on September 5th. She was canonized on September 4th, the eve of that same date, so that her feast day in the Church's calendar might fall each year on the anniversary of her death, the day of her birth into eternal life, as the Church has always understood the death of its saints. It is a small mercy of liturgical arrangement, but it is not a small thing. Every year now, on the 5th of September, the whole church, not merely the missionaries of charity, not merely Calcutta, not merely those old enough to remember her television appearances or her Nobel Prize acceptance speech, the whole church pauses to remember Saint Teresa of Calcutta. Priests around the world offer the Mass in her honor. Her name is spoken in the liturgy in languages she never spoke herself, in countries she never visited, by Catholics who were not yet born when she died. She is given, in the official title recognized by the Church, the description that fits her more perfectly than any other could: Mother of the Poorest of the Poor. It is not a poetic flourish added by an admiring writer. It is her formal place on the calendar of the Universal Church, the words by which the liturgy itself names her. Everything this book has tried to show you: the girl kneeling before the Black Madonna in Skopje, the young sister boarding the train to Darjeeling, the woman on her knees in the slums of Motachil learning to write letters in Bengali, the foundress bent double under a darkness she never let anyone see, the old woman standing before kings and presidents and refusing every comfort they offered her. All of it is folded now into that one phrase, spoken every year in every Catholic parish that keeps her feast: Mother of the Poorest of the Poor. She belongs to the world now in a way she never quite did while she was alive. In life she belonged, in the deepest sense, to Calcutta, to its gutters and its dying rooms, to the particular faces she picked up off particular streets, to the specific fever and stench and desperate need of one city in one corner of the earth. That is where her call had planted her, and she never once asked to be transplanted. But sainthood does something that even the widest fame cannot do. It does not merely make a person known everywhere. It makes her available everywhere, to be prayed to, imitated, invoked, and loved by anyone, anywhere, in any century that follows. The Albanian girl from Skopje, who once thought no one beyond her own small parish would ever know her name, is now asked, daily, by strangers on every continent, to pray for them. The nun the Vatican once worried was too controversial, too insistent, too unwilling to soften her message for comfortable audiences, is now held up by the Church itself as the very model of what mercy looks like when a human being lives it without reservation. She would not, in all likelihood, have wanted the fuss of it, the crowds, the titles, the marble statues that would eventually rise in her honor in cities she never visited. She spent her whole life trying to disappear behind the poor she served, insisting again and again that she was nothing, a pencil in God's hand, of no importance except as the instrument through which He chose to write. But the Church's declaration of her sainthood is not, finally, about her at all. It is a statement about where God can be found, and through whom. It says, "Look here, at this small stooped woman who knelt in the gutter, and see what love looks like when it is total." It says, "This is possible." It says, to every reader who ever wonders whether an ordinary life can be given entirely to God and come out the other side as something luminous, yes, look at her, she did it, now go and do the same. They came to her by the hundreds, young men and women from Europe and America and Australia, students on their break from university, retirees who had sold a house and bought a plane ticket, journalists who arrived meaning to write one story and left having written another. They came to Calcutta because Calcutta had become, in the world's imagination, the address of mercy itself. They wanted to hold a dying man's hand at Nirmal Haride. They wanted to bathe an abandoned child at Shishu Baham. They wanted, in the plain language most of them used when they finally sat across from her, to help. And Mother, again and again, sent some of them home. Not all of them. The missionaries of charity needed hands, and she was never too proud to take help where help was offered and the call was real. But to a great many of the earnest, the searching, the ones who had crossed oceans looking for a place large enough to matter in, she said some version of the same thing. Go home, find your own Calcutta. She meant it exactly as it sounds, and she meant it as a mercy, not a dismissal. She had watched too many people fly 7,000 miles to feed a stranger while a mother or a neighbor sat unvisited and unloved 3 streets from their own front door. She was not interested in poverty tourism, however sincere. She was interested in love, the particular, unglamorous, daily love that does not require a plane ticket, only eyes willing to see what is already in front of them. Calcutta was never, to her, a place on a map so much as a description of a wound. And wounds like that one do not require a visa. They are everywhere. A human being is lonely, unwanted, unloved, forgotten, sick, ashamed, or afraid. Which is to say, they are everywhere. So before this book closes, before it hands you on to the fuller telling that is waiting on the other side of this page, there is one more thing to ask of you, the reader, and it is not a summary. It is an invitation, the same one she gave to the strangers who found their way to her door in Calcutta for 40 years. Where is your Calcutta? Perhaps it is closer than a street corner. Perhaps it is a chair at your own table, a father who has gone quiet since his wife died, whom the family visits at Christmas and calls at Easter and otherwise leaves to his silence. Perhaps it is the man at the end of your street whom everyone privately calls difficult, whose lawn has gone to seed, who has not had a real conversation with another human being in longer than anyone wants to guess. Perhaps it is a colleague at the next desk, competent and pleasant and utterly alone, who eats lunch by herself every day and has for years, and no one has thought to ask why. Perhaps it is nearer still, a child in your own house who is fed and clothed and has never once heard you say, without hurry, without your phone in your hand, "I am glad you exist." Mother would have recognized every one of these as her distressing disguise. She did not reserve that phrase for the gutters of Calcutta. She used it for anyone Christ was wearing, and Christ, she believed with her whole body, wears the face of everyone the world has decided is not worth its time. The old woman in the nursing home nobody visits is wearing it. The teenager who has stopped eating because no one has told him he is loved for reasons that have nothing to do with his grades is wearing it. The immigrant standing alone at the edge of the parish hall after Mass, whom everyone is friendly to and no one actually befriends, is wearing it. So is the coworker recovering from an addiction the office pretends not to notice. So is the grandmother whose children call twice a year. So is the man sleeping under the overpass 3 exits from your house, whom you have driven past for a decade without ever learning his name. None of this requires you to found a religious order. She was very clear about that, and it is worth being just as clear here at the end of this book as it was at the beginning. You are not being asked to be Mother Teresa. There was only one Mother Teresa, and God does not repeat his masterpieces, he asks for new ones. What you are being asked, what she spent her whole life insisting anyone could do, regardless of talent or wealth or health or fame, is to do the next small thing with great love. Write the letter. Make the call. Sit in the chair beside the bed for 20 extra minutes when you had somewhere else to be. Learn the name. Say the sentence you have been too shy or too busy or too proud to say. That is the entire secret she spent 70 years trying to hand to a world that kept insisting the secret had to be more complicated than that. It never was. She would tell you, she told everyone who would listen, that you do not need to wait to feel ready. Feeling is not the currency of love, will is. She went to her own distressing disguise most days without a trace of the warm interior consolation you might imagine accompanied such work, especially in the second half of her life, when the darkness she carried in silence had settled over her prayer like a permanent winter. She washed the wounds and combed the lice out of matted hair and held the hands of the dying on days when God, by her own account in letters she asked to be burned and that were preserved anyway, felt entirely absent. She did it not because it felt like love, but because she had decided, once and permanently, that it was love and that her feelings were not going to be consulted on the matter. That decision, repeated every single day for the length of a very long life, is the whole of her sanctity in miniature. It is available to you on any ordinary Tuesday. So this is the invitation, plain and without decoration. Find the person nearest you who has been quietly filed under too much trouble and become the trouble worth taking. That is your Calcutta. It does not need a visa, it only needs you to stop walking past it. Now, the portrait you have just finished is complete in itself. You have knelt with her in the gutter of a Calcutta street over a dying stranger. You have walked with her from the balconied house on Skopje's Vardar River to the convent parlor at Laredo, from the swaying train to Darjeeling, where a call within a call broke open everything that came before it, to the leper colonies and the home for the dying and the courtyards full of children who had no one. You have sat, however briefly, in the far colder room of the darkness she carried for nearly 50 years and told almost no one about. You have watched the world, presidents, popes, film crews, a Nobel Committee in Oslo, come at last to her door, and you have watched her, after her death, become something larger even than herself, a saint the whole church now calls upon by name. That is the whole shape of the life, drawn once, quickly, in the hope that you would fall a little in love with her, the way so many of us have. If you have, then this book has done its only job. And now there is more, not because this book was incomplete, but because a life like hers cannot be exhausted in a single sitting any more than a single visit exhausts a person you have come to love. The fuller telling is waiting for you in 3 volumes, and each one holds something this one could only gesture toward. The first is called Gonxha, and it belongs entirely to the girl before she became Mother Teresa, the child born Agnes Gonxha Bojakshiu in Skopje in 1910, daughter of Nicola and Dronofile Bojakshiu, sister to Aga and Lazar, raised in a house where the door was never locked against a hungry stranger and the rosary was said every evening without exception. It holds the sudden death of her father when she was 8 years old, and the poverty and grief that followed, and the way her mother held the family together through faith and relentless work. It holds the parish of the Sacred Heart in Skopje, the sodality that first put mission stories from Bengal into a young girl's hands, and the slow, quiet certainty that grew in her. Not a lightning bolt, but a patient, deepening conviction that God was calling her to something beyond the only home she had ever known. It holds her departure at 18 for Ireland and then India, and her early years as a Loreto novice and young sister, teaching geography and catechism to the daughters of Calcutta's wealthier families behind convent walls, long before anyone, including her, imagined what was coming. If you want to understand the soil this life grew from, the family and the faith and the ordinary holiness that shaped her before the world ever knew her name, Gonxha is where you begin. The second volume is The Poorest of the Poor, and it holds the hinge on which the entire life turns. September 10, 1946, the day she calls Inspiration Day, when on a train bound for Darjeeling she received the call within the call, Christ's own thirst for souls, his command to leave the security and structure of Loreto and go into the slums to serve him in his most distressing disguise. This volume holds the excruciating 2 years of waiting for permission, the day she walked out of the convent she loved in a plain white sari with a blue border and 5 rupees in her pocket, and the founding in 1950 of the Missionaries of Charity. It holds the building of the mission brick by brick, Nirmal Hriday rising from an abandoned temple annex in Kaligat, the children's homes, the leprosy stations, the slow, patient multiplication of sisters and houses across Calcutta, and then across India, and then, astonishingly, across the world. And it holds, running underneath all of that visible growth like a hidden river, the decades of the darkness she carried, the interior desolation that began not long after her calling was confirmed and never fully lifted, the letters to her spiritual directors describing a soul that felt Christ's absence as sharply as it once felt his presence, born in near total silence for the rest of her life while she built, on the surface, one of the great works of mercy in the history of the Church. This is the volume for the reader who wants to walk beside her through the actual labor of the mission, the exhaustion, the opposition, the miracles of provision, the years when almost no one had heard of her, and who wants to understand that darkness, not as failure, but as the deepest form her union with Christ ever took. The third volume is Do Small Things with Great Love, and it turns from the events of her life toward what she left behind for you to actually live by. It holds her teaching in her own cadence and her own categories, the insistence on smallness, the refusal to let anyone excuse themselves from love on the grounds of insignificance, the theology of the distressing disguise applied not just to the streets of Calcutta, but to every ordinary room a reader might find herself in. It holds the darkness again, but seen now not primarily as a burden she bore, but as what her own letters and later spiritual directors came to understand it as, a love letter written in the strange grammar of absence, a participation in the abandonment Christ himself cried out from the cross, offered up finally and freely for souls. And it holds the living legacy, the missionaries of charity, as they exist today in more than 130 countries, still taking in the dying and the abandoned exactly as she did, her canonization by Pope Francis in September of 2016. The way her image and her words have gone on quietly convicting and comforting people who never met her and never will, in every language, on every continent. This is the volume for the reader who has already fallen in love with her and now wants to know, what do I do with that love? How do I actually live the way she lived? Together, the 3 volumes give you the whole woman, the girl, the call, the decades of labor and hidden suffering, the teaching she left, and the fire she is still setting in ordinary hearts. This book was only ever meant to be the doorway. You have stood in it. The house is larger than this single room, and every room in it is warm. But before you go looking for the fuller house, go and do the one thing she would have asked of you first, the thing that made every page you have just read possible in the first place. Go and find your Calcutta. It will not be hard to find, it rarely is. It is the person you have already half noticed and mostly managed to avoid. Go to them today, if you can, this week if you cannot, and do not wait to feel ready or holy or equal to it. Bring nothing but your presence and whatever love you can gather up on short notice, which is always more than you think. She is not asking you to build a hospital or found an order or become famous for your goodness. She built and founded and became famous almost by accident as the byproduct of thousands of unglamorous days no one photographed. What she is asking, from wherever she stands now, close to the God she loved through fire and through ice alike, is only this, that you would let her life be an invitation and not merely a story. That somewhere, this week, in some small unremarkable moment nobody else will notice, you would kneel down in whatever gutter is nearest you and do one small thing, with great love, for one person the world has forgotten how to see. That is the whole of it. That was always the whole of it. Go in peace and go gently toward whoever is waiting for you. She is praying, even now, that you will find them.